Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Very welcome to our audience who've come to this lovely auditorium at Corpus Christi College on this, at least it's not rainy day in Oxford. You're very welcome to those who've come from outside of Oxford as well, but also particularly the people who have been joining us online and who have come from far. Some people even from California, I think. So they've stayed up for you. Some people in the East Coast who've gotten up very early for our wonderful speaker today. So before I introduce our speaker, allow me to say a few words about the Reza Hosseini Memorial Lecture Series. It was created last year. I see some people who were here last year are here today, which is wonderful to see. In 2023, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the bombing of the United Nations Canal Hotel headquarters in Baghdad on the 19th of August 2003, which killed Reza Hosseini and 21 colleagues and injured dozens others. And this was really a turning point, not only for us for having lost loved ones, friends, and colleagues, but also because it was the first time that the United Nations, which was, and I still think remains, the greatest symbol and most legitimate purveyor of impartiality in the world, was attacked so brutally, causing irrevocable damage to the institution that had, until then, seemed off limits to large-scale and indiscriminate acts of terror. So I set up this lecture series not only to honor those we have lost in this attack, but also to turn their legacy into a force for good. Specifically, Reza's legacy, who was depicted on the slide when you walked in. And he had a special gift for connecting with the people he served as a humanitarian, working with Afghan refugees in Iran and refugees and internally displaced people in East Timor. He loved to listen to their stories, having learned their languages and dialects, which made him such an effective operator on the ground, while also always remaining kind, caring, and respectful. And so this is a venue for celebrating the power of stories as a way to connect. We all have stories to tell, and do remember after the lecture to keep telling them to those who will listen. Last year, we heard the powerful words of Ghassan Salameh, the diplomat and politician, I think he might be on this call today as well, very welcome, who served the United Nations mission in Iraq when the bomb went off. And he shared his stories from his time in the Canal Hotel in Baghdad. So this brings me to this year's speaker. I'm so thrilled and deeply grateful that you, Will Dalrymple, have agreed to be our second speaker in the Reza Hosseini Memorial Lecture Series to share with us the fascinating story and stories of the Barmakids, who not only feature in your sparkling, brand spanking new book, The Golden Road, which we'll be hearing about, no doubt, but also because I couldn't think of a more fitting subject when speaking of connectivity across cultures and divides. The Barmakids are it. And I suppose I can share a little unknown tidbit that William Dalrymple, Reza, and no, not William Dalrymple, William Dalrymple's relative, Reza, and I worked together in East Timor. And so Will is only 1 degree removed from Reza. Now, to the person you have all been waiting for, William Dalrymple. Will has just been visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, 2023 to 24. His books about India, Afghanistan, and the Middle East have fascinated millions, I'm told now, readership of millions. I don't know what this sound is, but it's not me. Oh, it's that. Sorry. Fascinated millions of readers around the world. He's won some of the most prestigious prizes for his wonderful books, my favorite, The White Mughals, but also The Last Mughal and others. He has 6 honorary doctorates. He held lectureships in Oxford, Princeton, and Brown University in the US. He's the founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literary Festival. And he has recently acquired even more fame with his much celebrated Empire podcast series with Anita Anand. Ladies and gentlemen, William Dalrymple.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a damp autumn morning. Thank you even more, those of you online at sort of 4 in the morning in California or whatever it is, and earlier still in the eastern United States. This is making very strange noises. Shall we? Okay. If it's easier for me just to speak with a standing mic, or yeah, should we take off the?
Maybe. Where's the? Oh, he's got it.
Sorry. I'm not going to be moving around very much, so anyway, I hold it until such time that we. Yeah, great. An easier thing. Very good. And what an enormous honor it is to speak at Reza's memorial lecture. We live sadly in a period. We live sadly in a period when the UN is very much no longer off limits, and some of the horrors we've seen UN staff suffer in Gaza, and the very many UN staff who have been killed there shows the importance of remembering those who work so bravely for the UN in difficult circumstances. What I'm going to say today, and how lovely to have in the audience so many friends. Apparently Andy Miller is watching from Kabul, Philip Marquis from Paris, and the wonderful Kevin Van Bladel from California, whose work absolutely kicked me off in this direction, and without whose brilliant essay on the Barmakids, none of this would have come to my attention. Also to have Hugh Kennedy in the audience, who apparently has made the trip, especially up from London. I'm very honoured, sir, that you've made it here, and your work has been great inspiration at every stage of my reading of this. But this book, The Golden Road, is specifically about the diffusion of Indian ideas and tries to bring together parts of the wider effects, the wider ripples of Indian ideas, which are often looked at in different academic silos. So the whole story of the spread of Buddhism from India, from Lumbini and Sarnath and Bodh Gaya, is often looked at as part of the story of the Silk Road, or the spread of Buddhism, and curated in those chambers of museums and in those departments of academia. The story of the spread of Indian influence in Southeast Asia comes usually under the heading of Sanskrit, and it is Sanskrit departments that tend to look at inscriptions of the Khmers or the Chams and record the reading and the influence of the Indian epics, classics, the Brahma Gupti, the Brahmi Gupta script, and all the other aspects of Indian culture that so change the history of Southeast Asia and have led to the largest Hindu temple in the world being built not in India, but in Cambodia at Angkor Wat, which is also, incidentally, probably the largest religious building of any sort in the world. The area within the moat at Angkor Wat is 4 times the size of the Vatican City. But one aspect of this diffusion of Indian ideas, which touches us all every day in the West, is the story of the diffusion of Indian numbers. the nearest thing the human race has really to a universal language around the globe. In the West, we call it Arabic numbers because the West, of course, borrowed it from the Arab world. But very few people in the West seem to know what every Indian knows and what every Indian proudly remembers, that these numbers originated in India and diffused out from there. The vital leap from India to the Arab world is the story that I'll be telling today. And am I walking off?
No, I'm just going to let people in. Sorry, ignore me.
The story of how Indian numbers passed from the Indosphere into the Islamic world, into the Arab world, into Abbasid Baghdad, is the story that I will be dealing with today. And the Barmakids are at the heart of that. Perhaps I should say at the beginning that the next stage is another familiar figure. It's only in the 12th century that Arabic numbers become popular in Europe through Fibonacci, no less. Fibonacci is brought up as an expat kid in Algeria, born in Pisa. His father runs the Pisan Customs House in Béjaïa, modern Oran in Algeria. And he, just like my kids, went to school in Delhi and as a matter of course learned Hindi. One of them incidentally ended up at this college, Corpus Christi, where we're speaking today. So Fibonacci is just a matter of course learned Arabic and the normal mathematics taught in the schools of Algeria at that period. And it's only when he gets back to Pisa that he realizes his school friends in Italy are still doing long multiplication of MCV_XV111 times CMXV1. And as you can imagine, he realized that his friends needed help. And it's when he writes his Liber Abaci that Frederick II gets to, the Holy Roman Emperor, Stupor Mundi, gets to hear about these numbers. And they pass from being an enthusiasm of a small scholarly group who were using them already in the universities to the general mercantile public. But how does the first step take place? How do we move from the world of Indian mathematics to the Arab world? In the winter of 773, a delegation from the Raja of Sindh arrived at the newly built city of Baghdad. The great circular city, capital of the young Abbasid Caliphate and the center of the Islamic world, was only 9 years old. But already it was one of the largest conurbations in the world. Its cosmopolitan population numbered more than 500,000 souls, a melting pot full not just of diverse Arab tribes, but also Persians, Turks, Africans, Armenians, Indians, Jews, Syrians, Slavs, and Byzantine Greeks. It was already a magnificent sight, dazzling travelers, with its grand new palaces, mosques, colleges, libraries, and pleasure gardens, spreading on for several miles along the fertile banks of the Tigris. The Sindhi court, which had dispatched the embassy in 773, had good reason to maintain friendly relations with the Caliph Mansur. His dominions stretched out westwards as far as the coast of Tunisia and northwards to the frontiers of Tang China. The outlines of this empire had been established a century and a half earlier, but the border of China was a much more recent event and had been established only 22 years earlier, when the Arabs had inflicted a bloody defeat on the massed troops of Tang China at the Battle of Talas in 751. The Indus, which now formed the frontier with the patchwork of Hindu courts lying to the east, was easily crossed in the dry season, and the Sindhis had no wish to create any offence or give any excuse which might propel the Abbasid armies across the river and into their realms. For this reason, the delegation came bearing rich gifts. But one present was particularly anticipated. Indeed, it had been specifically requested by none other than the chief vizier, who had sent out emissaries to search for it. This gift was not jewels or gold or mangoes or spices, nor the intricate cotton weaves for which Sind was celebrated, nor any of the other products of that region. Instead, it was a single handwritten manuscript. Along with the text, there came a group of Brahmin astrologers and sages from the Indian city of Ujjain, who'd been specially chosen to explain its contents. One of those named, Kanaka, the Indian, became a celebrated figure in the histories of Islamic astronomy. The manuscripts, which the Arabs came to call the Great Sind Hind, was in some ways a surprising gift, in that it was, in essence, a book of complex mathematical theory. It contained a variety of innovative ideas about science, astronomy, astrology, and mathematics, but as was the norm in India with such texts, it was written as a rhyming Sanskrit poem. This made it easier for students to memorize, but the terse, dense, difficult Sanskrit text only added to the struggles of the same students trying to understand the ideas contained within it. Such verses were usually accompanied with voluminous explanatory prose commentaries. In this case, however, Kanaka and his Brahmins had come to provide the commentary in person. The text of this edition of the Sind Hind no longer survives. All that exists today are much later and possibly very different manuscript versions, and its original form is not entirely clear. But according to the 10th century account of the well-traveled Arab geographer al-Masudi, it contained all that the Hindus knew of the spheres and the stars. It was a compilation of important scientific texts, and therefore, in an age when such knowledge was scattered and fragmented, a gift of incalculable value. The author and compiler was one of the supreme scientific minds in Indian history, the great Barmagupta, who lived from 598 to 670. Born near the Rajasthani hill station of Mount Abu, Barmagupta lived most of his life in Bilamala, modern Binmal. In 628, when he was 30 years old, he wrote a 25-chapter treatise on mathematics, later known as the Opening of the Universe, which was immediately recognized as a work of extraordinary subtlety and genius. In it, Barmagupta speculated at length, and for the first time, about the qualities of the number 0. Barmagupta's work contained within it other crucial Indian mathematical ideas developed by earlier generations of Brahmin scholars, such as the concept of positional notation, the idea of writing numbers with just 10 digits, but arranged in decimal columns of tens, hundreds, and thousands. The text also came with a complete set of trigonometry tables of sines and versines, from which the Arabs fashioned a set of accurate astronomical tables. Indian ideas about science and maths had long intrigued and dazzled the intellectuals of the Middle East. As early as the 2nd century BCE, an inscription of the Greek city of Miletos on the distant coast of Anatolia cites the Indian scholar known to the Greeks as Kalenius, probably a Greek rendering of the Sanskrit Kalyana, and as an authority on the movement of the stars and meteorology. 800 years after this, in 662 AD, the Syrian Monophysite bishop, Severus Sebot, wrote with similar reverence of, quote, the science of the Indians, including the subtle discoveries in astronomy, discoveries that were more ingenious than those of the Greeks and Babylonians, and their valuable methods of calculation which surpassed description, done by means of the 9 signs. But the Sindh contained even more than this. Later in his life, Brahmagupta had gone on to become apparently the head of the great Gupta-era astronomical observatory at Ujjain, the foremost center for the study of the stars in ancient India. A century or so before the embassy to Baghdad in 664-5, at the age of 67, Brahmagupta had written a practical manual of Indian astronomy and a guide to astronomical techniques and instruments. This summarized his ideas on the stars and the skies, enabling the prediction of eclipses and bringing together his different astronomical and astrological discoveries and thoughts. The Sindh seems to be an addition of both of Brahmagupta's key texts rolled into one. At least that was David Ingrid's final thoughts on the matter. Caliph Mansur was renowned as a patron of scholarship by this time, and he received the book eagerly. Understanding its importance, he gave orders to have it translated by the chief astronomer, Muhammad al-Fazari, quote, so that the Arabs might understand the motions of the planets. Al-Fazari was a philosopher, mathematician, and principal scientific advisor to the Abbasid court, renowned in his day as being, quote, outstanding in the science of the stars, a speaker of future events, and experienced in the properties of the planets. Al-Fazari had already built the first astrolabe in the Islamic world, as well as creating the first astronomical tables. He also filled 10 volumes with his astrological poems. He apparently learned and understood some Sanskrit. And it was he who, with the help of Kanaka and the other visiting Brahmins of Ujjain, all, quote, experts in the motions of the planet and the operation of the spheres and their eclipses, who began the difficult task of translating the abstruse and somewhat obscure Sanskrit poetry of the Sindh into clear and comprehensible Arabic prose, so that none of the most subtle nuances of the Sanskrit would be lost. But one person in Baghdad who maybe did not require any translation was the powerful chief vizier, Khalid ibn Barmak. It seems that Barmak may not only have been able to read the Sindh, but already had a training in Indian mathematics and astronomy. Indeed, it was probably his extraordinary facility with numbers that first led to his rapid rise to power, initially as paymaster to the caliph, and then, later, taking on the rest of the administration. Even the vizier's name, Barmak, was an Arabicization of a Sanskrit word, pramukh, which means headman or simply boss. For the vizier and his children, who would in due course succeed him at the helm of the affairs of the empire, all knew more about Indian science than many of their subjects may have realized. Before their conversion to Islam, as Kevin Van Bladel has brilliantly shown, the Barmakids had been hereditary rectors of one of the most important institutions of learning in the Indosphere. This was Naubahar, or Sanskrit Navavihara, the new monastery of Balkh, the greatest Buddhist center of learning in what is now Afghanistan, and in many ways the Central Asian equivalent of the great Mahavihara of Nalanda. Xuanzang, the Chinese pilgrim, had visited it only a century earlier and described its reputation for learning. And for centuries from this base, the Barmakids, under the guidance from this base, the Barmakids had been the intellectual intermediaries between India and Persianate Central Asia. And under their guidance, Naubahar had become a major center for translation and editing of Buddhist texts from India, as they made their way northwards and eastwards up the trade routes to China. The head of the Barmakid family was the hereditary ruler of the Balkh oasis on behalf of the Buddhist monastic principality that he governed. The Barmakids had married into many of the royal families of the Upper Oxus, and, quote, all the inhabitants of that district were slaves upon whom he adjudicated however he wished. They likened the building to Mecca in prestige and importance, Their custom, whenever they arrived at the monastery, was to bow before the biggest idol and kiss Barmak's hand. Long before his conversion to Islam, when still a young student of Buddhism, the vizier's father, the original Barmak, had traveled to another of the main centers of Indian learning, the Valley of Kashmir. There, again, as Kevin van Bledel has brilliantly shown, he spent years studying astrology, medicine, and the branches of philosophy. The Barmakids, in other words, were not just interested in the wonders of Indic mathematics and science, they were an important part of that tradition, educated at some of the greatest centers of Indic learning of the day. Then, 664, a large Umayyad Arab army began erecting their tents and siege engines outside the walls of the sophisticated Buddhist city of Balkh, with its stupa 100 cubits in diameter, with a circular arcade around it, decorated with paintings and precious gems, and hung with fragrant herbs, silk brocades, and silk flags. They made short work of the great Buddhist monastery. The massive remains of Naubaha can still be seen beyond the ruined walls of Balkh, and it was this valuable position, undefended by the city walls. Sorry, it was this vulnerable position, undefended by the city walls, in a kingless monastic principality with no armed forces, that led to its instant surrender at the start of the siege. The hereditary rectors or pramukhs of Naubaha were pragmatic men, as well as brilliant scholars and administrators. Realizing that the way the global headwinds were blowing, they surrendered their city and shortly afterwards made a formal conversion to the new Islamic faith that had propelled these warriors all the way from the Hejaz. The only member of the landowning priesthood of Naubaha not to convert in 664 was the eldest son and heir of the hereditary rector. Barmak was not present at the siege of Balkh because he was undertaking further studies at the great center of Asian learning, the Valley of Kashmir. Barmak dived deeper into Indian mathematics, Ayurvedic medicine, Hindu and Buddhist astrology, and various branches of Indian philosophy. In due course, when he returned to Balkh, he was sent by the new Arab overlords to the center of their empire. This was Rasafa, south of the Euphrates in Syria, where the caliph's Hisham al-Malik had built his favorite residence. Here, Barmak and his son Khalid ibn Barmak were ostensibly to be educated in the new faith and the Arabic language. In reality, they were held as hostages, acting as a guarantee and security for the good behavior of the family, who had remained in charge of Balkh as governors and administrators of the new regime. What must have seemed at the time as a restrictive forced exile proved in due course to be an extraordinary stroke of luck. For in Rasafa, Khalid became the classmate and friend of the son of the caliph. Moreover, he became close to another young Arab prince named Abu Jafar al-Mansur. Such was the closeness of the two boys that in time their wives even suckled each other's children, a link which bound the Abbasid and Barmakid clans for 4 successive generations. 2 decades later, long after the father and son had returned to Balkh, Khalid fought alongside his friend when in 750 CE, al-Mansur helped lead the revolution which ousted the remaining Umayyad dynasty and replaced them with al-Mansur's Abbasids. Vital to their success was the assistance of the Persian-speaking Khurasaniya, or Central Asian troops, some of whom were brought by the Barmakids from Balkh. The revolution started at Merv in Central Asia in 747, and the two armies met on the banks of the river Zab, south of Mosul. The Khurasanis formed a spear wall, calmly kneeling in line with their lances directed at the oncoming Umayyad cavalry. The spear wall held, and the Abbasid armies finally swept into Damascus, the Umayyad capital, in 750. In some ways, it can be seen as an Eastern Persian counter-revolution against the Arabs who had conquered them only a generation or 2 earlier. By the time that the revolution had reached its climax, Khalid ibn Barmak had become its chief secretary. One source mentions his financial and arithmetical skills and notes how effectively he reorganized the accounts of the Abbasid army into bound books rather than chaotic, loose scrolls that had formerly been the basis of the army accounting. It seems likely that Khalid had been trained, like his father and presumably the rest of the family, in Indian methods of arithmetic. Later, when peace was established, he was made the governor of Fars, which had been the center of the old Sasanian Empire, and there worked wonders, including discovering the golden treasuries of the old Persian kings, which they had hidden in the mountains when fleeing the invasions. Before long, Khalid had been promoted to be de facto vizier under the first Arab caliph. He also advised the second caliph, who was none other than his old friend and classmate from Rasafa, al-Mansur. His first job was to build the Abbasids a new permanent capital, to be known as the City of Peace. For 2 generations in the 8th and 9th centuries, it was this sophisticated Indophile, Khalid ibn Barmak, and his scholarly son Yahya, who brought to the Arabs much that was most remarkable in the learning and science of India and the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which stretched all the way from Buddhist Central Asia to Bali. Later, it was Khalid who personally helped plan Baghdad on a circular design, common in Central Asia and maybe originally inspired by the Indian concept of the mandala. Once the new city was built, he and his son had sought out the learning of ancient India and helped it to transfuse into the lifeblood of the young Islamic capital. From their salons and studies, they also helped to give the Abbasid court the spirit of intellectual inquiry that allowed it to hungrily begin absorbing diverse ideas from East and West, from all the great civilizations of classical antiquity, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Chinese. The most recent borrowing from the latter was the crucial innovation of paper. The Barmakids had recently set up the first paper mill in Baghdad, said, although this has been disputed, to have been run by Chinese prisoners of war captured on the battlefield of Talas. Either way, the Barmakids became celebrated for their generosity to scholars, writers, artists, poets, and singers. Khalid is said to have given a poet 10,000 dinars for writing a single eulogy. One poet praises his, quote, deep wisdom, his energy, his learning, and his forcefulness. Another called him generous, true to his word, pious, humane, firm, and clever. The Barmakids were also genuine polymaths, and their gaze extended west as well as east. To supplement the translations that they'd commissioned from Sanskrit, they began to commission translations from Greek, bringing Euclid's Elements and garlands on the natural faculties into Arabic for the first time, as well as works by Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Dioscorides. In this way, they made available to inquisitive scholars in Baghdad the most important Western classical works of maths, geometry, and astronomy, seeding what would soon turn into a great flowering scholarship. But for all the breadth of their interest, the Sanskrit world of India remained the abiding passions of the Barmakids, so much so that some envious rivals gossiped that the family was still secretly Buddhist, and that they would smile excitedly at any mention of Indian religions. Quote, when polytheism is mentioned in a learned salon, the Barmakids' faces rise up, and if a verse of the Quran is recited among them, they bring up stories about Mazdak, famous pre-Islamic heritage. It seems to have been true that Khalid ibn Barmak never forgot his Buddhist roots. He and his children continued to show particular interest in collating Sanskrit manuscripts on subjects ranging from agriculture, alchemy, to astronomy and astrology, from pharmacology and mathematics to medicine and architecture. He threw at this passion all the resources of the mighty Abbasid Empire. In this way, Khalid continued the work of translations that had been the mark of his Norbahar forebears, but on a much larger scale. The era of Barmakid rule in Baghdad coincided with what some scholars have called the Indian phase of early Islam. In time, the scholars of Baghdad would turn to the Greeks to unlock the secrets of the stars. But initially, under the Barmakids, it was to the astronomers of India and their Sanskrit treatises that the Arab astronomers looked for enlightenment. They learnt from Brahmagupta earlier than Ptolemy, according to Al-Biruni. In this, the Abbasids may well have been influenced by the model of the Chinese town court, then the major power on the caliph's eastern border. The Chinese government, since the time of the Empress Wu Zetian, had endowed Indian scholarship, and particularly astronomy, with a particularly high status. It may well have been that at this court, it may well have been this that Al-Mansur was trying to emulate when he and the Barmakids began inviting to their court Indian intellectuals from around South Asia. According to a much later account, written in 11th century Spain, it was a Jewish emissary who Khalid had first sent to the holy city of Ujjain. He knew Ujjain to be the center of Hindu astronomy, and it was used as a reference point for astronomical measurements, just as the Greenwich Meridian is used today. Incidentally, when these manuscripts, which were brought back to Baghdad by the Barmakids, then get translated again a generation later by Al-Khwarizmi. And when Al-Khwarizmi's work finally gets to England, Adelard of Bath is sitting in Wales, not so very far from here, puzzling over this meridian, which is called Arin in the text of Al-Khwarizmi. And it's Ujjain, it's just Ujjain. But I love the idea of someone sitting in 12th century Somerset, puzzling over places in Madhya Pradesh. The same Indian delegation from Sindh that brought the Sindh Hind in 733 also included doctors who were expert in the Indian medical science or Ayurveda. The historian Al-Tabari mentions that the caliph's doctors had been unable to suggest a solution to the problems of his digestion, and the caliph, perhaps under Barmakid influence, decided to look to Indian medicine for a solution. According to Al-Tabari, the caliph had initially asked the Arab doctors to bring him digestives, but they claimed it would only intensify the illness and recommended the caliph to eat less. But a nameless Indian doctor appeared and confirmed that digestives could indeed aggravate the condition, yet prepared an Ayurvedic drug for the caliph, a digestive powder of hot spices and medicaments to ease his pain. Al-Mansur took it and was subsequently able to digest its food, for which he praised the doctor and Indian medical systems that he represented. Before long, the Barmakids had built a hospital in Baghdad, the Bimaristan al-Barmaka, that some maintained formed the blueprint for future Islamic medical institutions. Here, Indian medicine and medical organization were practiced in accordance with the writings of the great Indian philosopher Charaka, remembered as the father of Ayurveda. The Barmakids also employed several Indian physicians, as well as 2 translators, who were asked to render Charaka's Sanskrit medical works into Arabic, including his celebrated treatise on poisons and their antidotes. One of these Indian physicians served as the supervisor at the hospital and translated medical texts for Khalid's son Yahya. He was assisted by a man known as Manka, the Indian, who worked with Yahya as personal physician right up to his death. Among the Indian medical texts he translated were Bhagavata's Compendium on the Heart of the 8 Branches, along with 2 other texts originally composed in Kashmir in the mid-7th century, which may well have been among the books studied by the original Barmak when he went to the valley for further education. Yahya inherited all his father's scholarly passions, particularly the interest in Indian medicine. He even sent an emissary over the Indus to Sindh to speak to doctors and scholars and learn more about Indian medical practice and theory, as well as to collect what information he could about maths and astronomy, cosmology and religion. In particular, the emissary was tasked with collecting Indian medical texts, herbs, and pharmaceuticals. The original report no longer survives, but passages from within it have been preserved in the Kitab al-Hirist. The book represents some of the first Arabic writing on Indic medicine. It also contains some of the earliest Islamic accounts of Indian philosophy and religion, and includes a detailed description of the emissary's visit to a Hindu temple where, quote, the idols speak to devotees, as well as descriptions of celebrated holy sites such as the Sun Temple in Multan and the great Buddhas of Bamiyan. The one who is concerned with the subject of India was Yahya, wrote one historian. Indeed, all the Barmakids showed this obsession, and they were continually summoning Indian medical students and Indian philosophers here to Baghdad. Like his father, Yahya's interests were diverse. He is known to have commissioned a rendering in Persian verse of the life of the Buddha, as well as translations of the stories of Sinbad and the Indian Panchatantra stories, which became so popular in Arabic as Kalila wa Dimna. It was through translations like this, for example, that the Buddha's story of the blind man and the elephant crossed religions to become a Sufi teaching story. It was probably through Yahya's influence that around this time another Indian innovation became popular at the Abbasid court. Chess had been part of the Persian courtly world since Ferdowsi's epic poem, the Shahnameh, chess had become part of the Persian court since, according to Ferdowsi's epic poem, the Shahnameh, an emissary from Xuanzang's patron, King Harsha of Kanauj, challenged the intellectuals of Sasanian Persia to a game. Whether the story is true or not, chess was in origins an Indian name, initially known as Chaturanga, its name being a reference to the four limbs of an Indian army: soldiers, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. It became popular in Persia and Mesopotamia as Shatranj, with slightly altered rules and pieces. Many of these pieces are still known in the West today by their Persian names, such as the Rook, which derives from the Persian word for chariot. Likewise, the cry checkmate is actually the Persian Arabic shamat, meaning the king is dead. It may well have been through the Barmakids that chess became fashionable in the Abbasid court, where the young Harun al-Rashid was said to be a particular enthusiast. For Harun's tutor, who may have been the source of this interest, was none other than Yahya al-Barmak. At his pupil's accession to the throne in 786, Yahya succeeded his father Khalid as the principal administrator of the whole Abbasid Empire. He had almost total administrative control for 18 years, assisted by his two shrewd sons, Jafar and Fadl, who sat at his side during public audiences. The days of their rule, so it is said, wrote Masudi, were like a perpetual wedding feast, filled with unending happiness and joy. When Yahya eventually retired, his son Jafar of Barmak, in turn, took the place. Just as Khalid ibn Barmak had been the useful best friend of the future Caliph al-Mansur, so Jafar was the inseparable friend of Harun al-Rashid. The Arabian Nights are full of stories of the nocturnal adventures and youthful misbehavior of the pair as they roamed in disguise, carousing around the bars and flesh pots and back alleys of Baghdad, discussing poetry and music, sampling the best food and wine the empire could provide. They had what one historian has described as a very close, almost erotic friendship. The exceptionally good-looking Jafar is reputed to be the leader of Baghdadi fashion, was most elegantly and sharply dressed, and is said to have invented the passion for high collars to enhance the beauty of his long neck. And Jafar, those of you that know the Disney Aladdin will remember Jafar as the villain, but also the snappy dresser with the parrot on his shoulders. Only Disney really could turn the hero of one of the heroes of the Arabian Nights into a villain in the cartoon version, but we'll pass that by. Jafar had palaces dotted around Baghdad and estates across Mesopotamia, Persia, and Khorasan. So many indeed that rich as Jafar became a common term during his tenure. One of his residences in Baghdad alone cost him 20 million gold pieces. But, although extravagant, he was a brilliant administrator and jurist, a gifted calligrapher and musician, a connoisseur of singers and poets with a taste for tales and fables. especially from those of India. And like the other Barmakids, he continued to patronize the translation of Sanskrit science and philosophy. Jafar was the fourth generation of the Barmakids to work intimately with their milk brothers, the Abbasid caliphs. The tradition of mutual suckling continued to the end. Harun's baby nuzzled the breast of the Jafar's wife, and the daughter of Jafar was nursed by Zubaydah, the caliph's wife. But there was to be no fifth generation. In 1802 to 3, for reasons that are not still entirely clear, though Hugh has written much about possible reasons for it, there was a gradual estrangement between the caliph and the vizier. Harun seems to have become irritated with his former best friend and began to resent his dependence on the different branches of the Barmakid family. Eventually, he decided not only to crush his overmighty friend, but to destroy once and for all the power of the vizier's entire family. Later historians tried to explain his actions by gossiping about Jafar having a liaison with Harun's beautiful sister Abassa. In one version of the story, the two are even said to have had a secret love child who was sent off to Mecca to make sure no one heard about the scandalous liaison. Others blame the fall of the Barmakids on the envy and malevolence of Harun al-Rashid's much admired and somewhat formidable wife, Zubaydah. But the dramatic events which ended the careers of the Barmakids clearly came as a complete surprise to contemporaries, and the reasons remain mysterious to this day. There were no signs in advance of what was coming, and the coup took place overnight and without warning. Jafar himself was murdered on the very night of the coup, beheaded by Harun's personal bodyguard. Initially, the bodyguard could not believe his orders and went to Jafar to ask what to do. Yasir went to the house of Jafar, whom he found occupied with his pleasures. And he said to him, "Commander of the Faithful has ordered me to bring him your head." The Commander of the Faithful, said Jafar, likes to tease me. This is no doubt one of his jokes. "By God," replied the officer, "I have never seen him more serious." "If this isn't a joke, then he was drunk," said Jafar. "No, by God, he seemed fully in possession of his reason, and from the prayers I have seen him perform, I cannot believe he has drunk anything today." Jafar continued, "If ever I have done you service, there will never be a better occasion for you to recognize it than now. I am completely at your service for anything that is not against the will of the Commander of the Faithful." "Go back to him," said Jafar, "and tell him that you have carried out his order. If he shows regret, I shall owe you my life, and you may count on new favors from me. If, on the other hand, the decision remains constant, tomorrow you will perform your duty." The officer answered that it was not possible, that was not possible. Jafar said, "Then I will accompany you to the Commander of the Faithful, and I will place myself so as to hear his words and your reply. If, after you have exhausted all excuses, he will still not be satisfied with anything but my head, then you may come at once and accomplish your mission." "I agree to that," replied Yasir. They went, therefore, to Rashid's camp. Yasir went in to the caliph and said to him, "I have brought the head, O Commander of the Faithful, and it is here." "Bring it at once, motherfucker," said Rashid, "or yours shall fall." Jafar knew what his fate now was. He asked Yasir for permission to go home and make a will and free all his slaves. But messengers kept coming from the caliph asking if the deed had been done, and Yasir was becoming nervous. "Now do as you have been ordered," said Jafar. Then, drawing a small kerchief from his sleeve, he bandaged his eyes and stretched out his neck. Yasir cut off his head and took it to Rashid and placed it before him. The caliph approached it and began to enumerate all of Jafar's sins. Then Rashid said, "Oh, Yasir, bring me so-and-so." When they arrived, he said, "Cut off Yasir's head. I cannot bear the sight of the murderer of Jafar." But the bloodshed did not end there. Jafar's body, after being divided into 3 parts, was gibbeted on stakes and set up in the middle of each of the 3 bridges over the Tigris. The retired former vizier, Yahya, once Harun's tutor, now an old man, and Jafar's brother Fadl were both arrested and jailed, and they later died in prison after being tortured to reveal the hidden place of their fortune. The family's properties and slaves all passed into the possession of Zubaydah. No one dared show their feelings, and it was left to the poets to write their eulogies to the dead patrons in secret. See how the Barmakid blade of Indian steel has been struck by the steel of the Hashemites. The stars of generosity are out. The hand of benevolence is closed. The seas of bounty have ebbed away. Now the Barmakids are gone. Fate has betrayed the sons of Barmak. Did Yahya not govern the whole earth? Yet he woke to find himself beneath it. After the fall of the Barmakids, Arab intellectuals focused more on retrieving ancient Greek learning than on recovering that either of India or Persia. Perhaps too closely associated with the fallen viziers, the search for new learning from India gave way to the study of the Greek classics. Either way, the Barmakids were the now often forgotten but vital link between the ancient knowledge systems of India and those beginning to develop in the Arab world. In time, the works they commissioned also became the link with the new learning of Mediterranean Europe. Many years later, in 11th century Toledo, the Sindh will be translated from Arabic into both Hebrew and Latin. From there, according to David Pingree, still the leading scholar of the subject, along with Euclid and the astronomy of ancient Greece, it became the basis of the astronomy of medieval Western Europe. It's therefore not too much to say that because of the wide-ranging interest and enlightened patronage of the Barmakid family, that not only Indian astronomy, but Indian numerals and mathematics passed to the Arabs and hence to the wider world, so giving us the numerals, the decimal system, the basic methods of calculation that we all still use today. Thank you.